As you watch the following footage, you'll be listening to a special chapter taken from Sean McNamara's recent book, Renegade Mystic, which is now available as an audiobook. The chapter is titled The 100-Hour Telekinesis Challenge. It's recommended for both practitioners of telekinesis and researchers of paranormal phenomena, and explains why they're difficult to study in a laboratory environment. Along with Renegade Mystic, Sean is the author of Defy Your Limits, the Telekinesis Training Method, Meditation X, Telekinesis, and Signal and Noise, Advanced Psychic Training for Remote Viewing, Clairvoyance, and ESP. His online video training courses are at mindpossible.com.
Essay number 4, The 100-Hour Telekinesis Challenge for Students and Researchers. In May of 2019, I was invited to Portland to spend a few days with theoretical physicist George Weissman, Ph.D., and neuroscientist Mike Wellicke, Ph.D., who wanted to do some telekinesis experiments together. We were joined by Nancy Duterte, author and psychic teacher. The primary goal was to see if we could successfully move the object inside of a vacuum-sealed container and settle the question about how this type of psychokinesis actually happens. Nobody knows for certain what produces telekinesis. However, Dean Radin, Ph.D. from the Institute of Noetic Sciences and John Valentino from Princeton University both suggested to me that rather than moving the tinfoil or other objects directly, I might be causing the air molecules around it to move in such a way as to push on the object. This involves using consciousness to change the state of the molecular movement from one of randomness or entropy to one of coherence or syntropy. Personally, I believe they're correct. This is why testing telekinesis in a vacuum would help determine the cause. If the object still moved even when there wasn't air inside the container, then there'd have to be another reason for its movement. As part of the experiment, Mike and George wanted to make sure I wasn't simply heating up the air inside the container and causing the air to move by convection. Mike placed a highly sensitive thermometer inside the container. It was connected to special software which made it possible to watch the moment-by-moment change in temperature on a graph displayed on a nearby computer screen. As I usually did, I placed my hands on the glass to begin moving the object. This is my way of connecting with it. Normally, I'd move my hands a couple inches away after a few minutes, then place them in my lap a little bit later, and after a while, I'd stand several feet away from the whole setup while keeping the object moving. But now, we were able to see how quickly the temperature inside rose after I placed my hand on the glass. The temperature also rose when I merely put my hands very near the glass, not even touching it. As soon as we saw this, I came apart. I'd placed a lot of pressure on myself to do a good job for our group, and suddenly it looked like I wasn't actually doing telekinesis at all. I have to admit my intimidation by their credentials as PhDs, even though I'd already experienced them as kind, patient, enthusiastic, and optimistic. Even with their support, I fell into a foul mood, fearing I'd unintentionally committed fraud all these years by telling people I was using psychic means to move the object. We had only a few days together, and I spent most of that time emotionally kicking myself, which had the effect of rendering me nearly useless. It appeared that all this time I'd fallen victim to what psychologists referred to as confirmation bias. It appeared that any time the object moved, I falsely confirmed the cause to be something psychic instead of physical. I became frozen, stuck on the heat issue, which kept us from moving on to focusing on the vacuum question. Curiously, by the end of our time together, Nancy, George, and Mike still believed psychokinesis was real. I was the only one who'd lost all faith and was now ruminating about what kind of public detractions I needed to make. If anything, this revealed how much of an ego I developed around telekinesis and how fragile that ego was. Unfortunately, it wasn't until I'd left Portland when I realized my error. On the return flight, I inserted my earbuds to enjoy some soothing music, eager to forget about the whole affair. After listening to several tracks, I became deeply relaxed and allowed my mind to drift off. Eventually, I noticed a stream of thoughts entering my awareness, trying to get my attention. It was as if an old friend was trying to set me straight with a feeling of, "Don't you remember? Don't you remember?" When I was first learning telekinesis, I'd struggled for 2.5 months before seeing any movement at all, even with my hands very close to the glass. Don't you remember? With practice, I was able to change which direction of the object spun on the needle, even from a distance, by altering my breathing pattern and how I focused my mind. Don't you remember? Repeated sessions showed any time I began to try too hard, which increased my level of physical and mental tension, the object would slow down or come to a halt. Then, by relaxing myself once more, the object would commence its prior state of motion. This occurred even when I was seated several feet away. Don't you remember? I became more proficient the more I practiced. If the movement was solely due to heat, there would be no increase or change in how soon the object responded to me. The fact that my performance improved over time indicates this isn't random. Don't you remember? When using the same object for an extended period of time, it became increasingly responsive to my intention. It started moving at the beginning of the session faster than a fresh piece of tinfoil or paper would. Sometimes it even responded to me just as I entered the room, as if we had an established connection. This didn't happen with brand new objects. Don't you remember? When I placed 3 objects inside one container, they rarely moved at the same time. I could even focus on one of the objects and cause it to move without disturbing the others. Convection is too generalized for that kind of specificity. Don't you remember? When I aligned 3 containers, each with one object inside, and with one closest to me and the third furthest away, the furthest object would often be the one to respond to me first. But this one was least susceptible to my body heat, so why should it move while the others sat still? At other times, the second object, in between the closest and farthest containers, would move first. Don't you remember? Also, since heat is a natural byproduct or correlate of molecular movement, wouldn't it be impossible to cause the air to move by psychic means without increasing the temperature in the process? Therefore, even though heat was present, it didn't necessarily mean it caused the movement. Don't you remember? And so what if heat was helpful in getting the object moving? Have you ever push-started a car whose battery had died? It might be the case that the psychic effect is only discernible after the object has been brought into motion by ordinary means. Parapsychologists are well aware of cases where a placebo effect leads to a real outcome. For instance, when a shaman uses simple tricks to create the illusion of psychic healing, they produce objective, physical, and verifiable effects in a patient's body. To be absolutely clear, yes, I'm saying that fooling a person into thinking they're performing psychically can cause them to actualize their real psychic ability. As an aside, perhaps this is the true purpose of rituals in religious traditions. Might they simply be placebos which at one point long ago actually produced a result? Sadly, humans have a tendency to continue rituals long after losing their efficacy, simply in the name of tradition. And as the popular phrase goes, tradition is just peer pressure from dead people. It's also important to consider whether practicing a ritual imported from outside one's natural culture limits its potential. Maybe something important really does get lost in translation. Of course, that's something each person needs to decide for themselves. Let's return now to the main topic at hand. When I teach telekinesis in a classroom, the sessions generally last under 2 hours. In that time, everybody learns to successfully influence the movement of the object, usually tinfoil, sometimes paper, while keeping their hands in their laps. A portion of the group can go further, standing up and moving several feet away while continuing to influence it. Everyone begins the same way, by putting their hands directly on the glass, which is my instruction to help them connect to the object. And here's the problem. Who's to say that during the 2-hour class, some of them haven't actually used telekinesis even though they think they have? How can we be sure they weren't falling for confirmation bias, believing they were doing it when they really weren't? Several times during the class, I make sure to ask them if they've noticed the object's movement responding to their level of tension and relaxation. I also ask if any of them can control the direction and speed of the object by following the training instructions. In most cases, they say they can, but still, how can they be so sure? The challenge. The 100-hour challenge is a way for telekinesis students to immerse themselves in the experience and to confirm, to a high degree of confidence, that they can willfully influence the movement of the object. Simply keep a practice journal and log at least 100 clock hours of practicing telekinesis before deciding whether or not one is truly doing telekinesis. Until then, one should remain an open-minded skeptic, which means avoiding coming to conclusions either way, while focusing on collecting more data, direct experience in this case. Why 100 hours? Because in that length of time, a person will not only succeed at influencing a single object in a non-random manner, but they'll be able to experiment with influencing multiple objects in one container, then multiple containers, other kinds of objects, and from varying distances. The 100 hours implies the person will do most, if not all, of their experiments alone and at home, which is the most relaxing type of environment they could find. Being given a few hours in a laboratory where observers are hovering over you while a camera is recording everything is like begging for the experiment to fail. The various levels of stress created by this kind of environment can have debilitating consequences. The extended training period also increases the probability the practitioner will experience certain anomalies, such as a well-used object behaving as if it has a relationship with them. Other things might happen too, such as an increase in synchronicities or the enhancement of other psychic abilities like clairvoyance or precognition. About researchers and pseudo-skeptics. Researchers and pseudo-skeptics, or debunkers, should also be willing to undergo the 100-hour challenge when investigating telekinesis. As long as they follow the training instructions with at least a neutral attitude and a high level of fidelity, they'll realize there really is something to this. To give it a shot for 1 or 2 hours, then give up while saying it doesn't work just isn't fair. It's not that it doesn't work, but rather they didn't do the work themselves. But that's common behavior for pseudo-skeptics. They come to conclusions without doing any actual research or considering any data which contradicts their beliefs. Even if they do, they're prone to another kind of bias which affects us all, called the backfire effect. The backfire effect is the tendency for people who, having been shown facts which contradict their beliefs, respond by denying the facts even more vehemently and recommitting to their original stance. Similarly, too many people are quick to become believers and fall too easily for certain types of telekinesis demonstrations available on YouTube and other sites. It's difficult to tell whether the person in the video is attempting to fool the public on purpose or if they actually believe they're doing authentic telekinesis. To help new telekinesis students understand what I'm talking about, I've recorded myself performing fake telekinesis, mimicking a couple of the demonstrations I've seen online. These videos on this audiobook's website are intended as illustrations of possible confirmation bias or outright fraud.